Hi, good afternoon. I'm Tim Walker. I'm the the former president of the Chartered Institution of Waste Management. That was 2024 to 25. My day job is concerned with the procurement and securing of various waste services on behalf of 6 councils in Northern Ireland. But today we're going to cover a slightly different topic and a slightly different issue. We're going to look at the issue of a world driven by sustainable consumption and whether that is even possible. And this afternoon, I'm joined by two colleagues, and we're going to have a general discussion around this very topic. And I'm going to ask my two colleagues to introduce themselves. So, Maya, I'll start with you as your bottom left.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, and really looking forward to this conversation. So I have worked in circular economy for a number of years. Until 2022, I was working in circular economy in the government, leading on developing a waste prevention programme and leading on textiles, circular economy in that field, and also in construction. Busy trying to get circularity into the net zero strategy and make the links with climate. And since then, I've been working in part with businesses in the community on driving this sort of shift to circular economy. And then more recently, I've been living and working in India. I'm doing some work on developing a new program for a think tank on circularity, as well as setting up a new initiative around biomaterials, in effect, a circular biomaterials incubator. So really pleased to be here today.
Great. Thanks for that, Maya. And Beth.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for having me. So I am Beth Barker. I'm a policy manager at the Aldersgate Group. We're a UK-based alliance of different organisations from across different sectors. And we include large businesses, small businesses, environmental NGOs. And together we work towards pushing for a environmentally sustainable economy. And we particularly focus on UK policy. But we look across the world, and particularly at the EU. And we do quite a bit of work on circular economy. As will be no surprise, it touches across all of our business and organisations, from the likes of Tesco's thinking about these products that they sell and the packaging those products are in, to the likes of National Grid and the kind of infrastructure they're putting up and taking down, to the likes of the RSPB, who obviously care a huge amount about the environment and the impact human action has on the wildlife across the world. So yeah, really looking forward to this discussion.
So those are really wide topics both of you have given. And given that this is kind of underpinned by SDG 12, the whole idea of sustainable consumption and production, I'm just going to briefly recap for those in the audience who have either forgotten what this is about or just want to be refreshed as to what we're looking at. So the title GUF started off as geopolitical divisions deepen, the ripple effects on sustainability efforts are being felt across industries. Cross-border collaboration becomes more challenging, yet resource recovery and resilience remain critical to preserving the Earth's natural resources for future generations. Given what we've just heard from my two colleagues, would one of you or other of you like to sort of pick up on that initial theme about how are we going to look at this issue of the geopolitical divisions, which seem to be hardening and driving a wedge around what was previously a sort of a general consensus around sustainability, around environmental improvement, and around, I suppose, loosely, the issue of biodiversity, although that too has come under increasing pressure. Beth, I'll ask you to start. What are your views on that, about geopolitical divisions and that perspective of increasing polarization and where that fits? Where does sustainable consumption fit in that space?
Yes, it's a really good question. I think we're all acutely aware of the sort of rising tensions that we're seeing between the need to do things in a really radically different way around how we produce and consume goods, how we factor in all the different environmental factors, not just carbon, but water, other, pollution in the environment. And this is something that many businesses and obviously governments have been grappling with for some time. And we are seeing that growing tension. But I would also say that the action hasn't stopped. I think there is a bit of a growing myth that the business community and governments are taking a foot off the gas as we see tension go elsewhere. But a huge amount of the data we're seeing is that businesses are continuing to develop their climate plans, their wide sustainability strategies, including looking at nature-related risk and efforts to mitigate it. And we're also seeing a really interesting thing, that as we see geopolitical tensions rise, we're also seeing circular economy actually rise up business agendas, because there's this sort of real attention going on, resilient supply chains, critical materials, and how as a business and as a country you can mitigate potential risk and disruption. And so what we're seeing is that within businesses themselves, there's a huge amount of effort to secure this. And one example I have is I recently was speaking to Pandora, and they've set some really ambitious circular economy targets, looking at basically in 2020, they decided they wanted to only use recycled gold and silver in their jewelry products. And they wanted to do this in 5 years. And the reason they wanted to do this was because they wanted to reduce their carbon exposure, but also think about the circularity of their supply chain. And they were able to achieve this. And not only have they done that and really radically shifted how they're consuming, but they've done this while not really changing the consumption of their product, which I think is really interesting. And they've also managed to bake it into the business. So, for example, they have aligned their internal employee reward structures to sustainability. They've linked their financial products and loans to it. They've ensured their management and leadership is tied into it. And that's a way that they're really delivering kind of long-term structure. So that's just one example of how businesses are bringing in the carbon, the climate agenda, and the resource efficiency and security agenda in a kind of real world action.
Good. I mean, it's a really good example. I mean, I must admit I hadn't come across Pandora's attempts and efforts in this space before, but it doesn't surprise me at all. It does remind me of a great old ad I used to enjoy at a personal level every time I passed it on the Lower Newton Ards Road, which was "Wanted, scrap gold." And I was just that thought of scrap gold has always chimed with me, because I've always been intrigued what scrap gold actually looks like. But Maya, from your perspective, I mean, what are you seeing in India, and what are you seeing sort of in the hinterlands beyond that? About you were talking earlier on about that idea of sort of creating circular hubs. Is what Beth is suggesting something that has got immediate transferability, or is there a specific lens or viewpoint that's developing in where you are? Oh, Maya, you're on mute just now. There we go.
Okay, off mute. Right. Well, first, really interesting to hear what Beth was saying and the examples that she gave. What I would say in India, in terms of, first of all, just beginning with those geopolitical tensions, there are some, I'd say in the West, people see it as China somehow gaining from the climate agenda and not the West. In India, there's a sort of feeling that the West tells India what to do. And they don't much like it. It's like, why should we be working on cutting our carbon emissions when we didn't cause it? And that can be a bit of a problem. But I'd say, on the other hand, what we do have is a lot of quite a strong sense of there being opportunities in terms of circularity, circular economy type solutions. So we're seeing, I'll just give you a number of different examples. One is on textiles. So there's clearly a lot of textile production in India. There's a lot of waste textiles from industry. There's an alliance called the Restart Alliance working on recycling, mainly post-industrial waste, but also beginning to look at the opportunities from recycling post-consumer waste. So the feeling is that India does have some real benefits, real opportunities. At the moment, most of the viable businesses are in the upcycling world. So it's sort of like old scrap material turned into new products rather than unraveling them and going back to the beginning in terms of yarn, etc. So there's still R&D challenges, trying to get the right sort of like chemical recycling processes, making them commercially viable. There's still a fair amount to be done there, and potential for collaboration across boundaries to share knowledge and thinking and ideas and on these different technologies. I myself been working in this field of biomaterials and circular biomaterials, and what we see there are some sort of real win-wins in a country like India. So in particular in agro waste. So what you see this time of the year in India, the rice stubble will be burnt across northern India, and this stubble could be used, the rice straw could be used for things like construction materials, but for various sort of almost logistical reasons it isn't, and it's just burned. But we are, the organisation I'm working with called Materia Verde, we are looking at how we can ensure that there is sufficient demand for these sort of recycled materials, supporting businesses develop the new product, what we call sort of venture design. Some of it's really about R&D. So there are a lot of opportunities which people do recognise, and I would say that sort of feeling that we've sort of had enough of acting on climate change and it all costs too much. I wouldn't see that as really where we are in India. But there are other issues which I would say around conspicuous consumption and sort of so buying bigger, more expensive things, big cars, lots of stuff. You see big weddings. I think, Beth, you were talking about sort of scrap gold and things like that, but very really extravagant sort of weddings and other things. So that sort of element of consumption is potentially quite problematic when you look at a country with as many people as that. So that's one of the challenges of how do we deal with this sort of growing consumption with a huge number of people. But I certainly think the businesses see opportunities, and that the business world could be the real the sort of lever and the engine of change.
Yeah, I'd love to just
Yeah,
quickly
I mean,
come
certainly
in.
that issue of sort of conspicuous consumption is a really big issue. And I was looking at one of the graphs just today, which showed the sheer carbon emissions coming out of the top 1%, which are just phenomenal. And given the rate of growth in the global south of those millionaires and billionaires, if they're going to follow the trajectory that was done in the global north, that could have quite profound implications in terms of consumption and consumption patterns, and also creating an expectation in society for others to follow. That this idea that this conspicuous consumption was something to aspire to, and that was in and of itself a good thing. And we see it in the global north with many of the TV shows and magazines that are on display, which kind of celebrate this idea of being on trend and being the perfect body, being the perfect person. But it's all untethered from the sort of consequence of the actions of that. And for me in local government, I guess it might be an age thing, but given the regular number of charity shops and other sort of community ventures, I'm meeting more and more people at these events. So there is at a low level, at a very community level, an increasing engagement with stuff and with people and with experiences. As I said, it might be an age thing, but as a professional waster, the issue I find is the sheer volume of material that ends up being junked on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis is still pretty phenomenal, and shows, even with those interventions and those sort of changing mindsets, it shows little sign of shifting or being reduced in the global north. And given that SDG 12, one of the key issues in it was around resource efficiency and ultimately waste prevention, waste minimization, it seems to me that we really struggle to articulate what that means in practical terms, not just for industry, but for communities, for the householder, in pragmatic ways that does not feel something like a hair shirt. Now, it might be interesting, Beth, from your side, given that so much of industry is predicated on the premise of buying more, selling more. How do we shift to a product as a service in a really realistic way? And Maya, in regards to the global south, and I guess India specifically, how do we kind of turn the corner so there isn't this idea that we all just have lots and lots and lots of more stuff to display our status in society and to show that we have become a success because we have 1,000 pairs of shoes, as Imelda Marcos was once famous for, the former wife of the Philippines ruler in the 1980s or 1990s, 1980s, I think it was. So, Beth, I posed a question to you about that issue about sell more. Have you got any thoughts on that?
I think it's a really, really good point and a huge challenge. And I think, as much as I'm very keen to highlight lots of examples where, things are changing on the ground, where businesses are implementing things and policies changing things, I think it's really important to acknowledge that, as you really well just talked us through, the pressures and the consumption is still very much part of our daily lives. And that kind of, I suppose, that sort of fundamental issue of the environmental, economic, and social impacts of large-scale consumption being very much hidden still from you as the individual consumer. Your waste goes into your bin and that gets collected, and that is still quite removed. And we recently, this summer, we went to Raynham Marshes, which is an RSPB site just on the Thames, and we were looking at the RSPB site and the work they're doing there, but we also went onto the shoreline, and it was really very stark as an image because there was layers and layers and layers of waste, plastic waste in particular, and it was a really stark reminder of that. All of that waste that we all produce goes somewhere.
That could actually be spilling out of the old landfill site, which is beginning to be exposed to rising from climate change and the increasing sea levels. But that could be a slightly different matter, and probably is something else that CIWM will pick up for a podcast, is the increasing vulnerability and risk of the former landfill sites located in coastal locations. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you there, Beth.
No, it's a really important point. What I was going to say is that there are some interesting changes taking place. We have seen the role of the secondhand market it's been around for a long time, and in some ways it's been there and come back. But there are, especially among young people, really strong leanings towards using some of these reselling apps like Vinted, and these apps are making it really easy to engage in the kind of secondary market, which has been really interesting. But from a business perspective, when it comes to making products that are more circular and changing the way that we consume, you'll often hear that the product has to be as good, it has to function as well, it has to be as good quality, if not better, and the cost needs to not be too much. And those are sort of some of the key factors when you're trying to compete with a more sustainable product, which I think all is true. But there are some really interesting examples of where this is changing and businesses are having real success. So one of our members, Kingfisher, they own Screwfix and B&Q, something that many people interact with as part. And they have found that I think this year, 50% of their sales were from sustainable products. And that is because they've been implementing several schemes that change the way they interact with their customers. So one, for example, B&Q have a plant pot return scheme, and then they're able to recycle them. And that they found that this is because this is a problem for the consumer, that you end up with these plant pots after you've gone and bought them, and then you don't know what to do with them. And so B&Q have solved that problem in a way that's circular. Similarly, they're doing product refurb and also product hire and tool hire, and both of those are proven to be really, really successful. And gradually over time, by finding what problems consumers have and how they can integrate them with their sustainability structure, understanding how to change the way that goods are consumed. And so there are lots and lots of examples of this happening across the economy. And I think where we can find those things, implement them, and through collaboration with other businesses, establish them, there's a huge opportunity to change consumption. But it is small scale, it's incremental, and it doesn't necessarily fundamentally address that kind of linear, massive, conspicuous consumption as you mentioned before.
It's a really good example, and certainly I like the idea of the reusable plastic pots. I often wonder, are they recyclable in the standard household recycling services, given that many now offer PTT, plastic pots, tubs, and trays? So does a flower pot actually constitute a pot? Because they both have the same name in them. But that's more of a whimsy. And I recognize the idea of product as a service and the scope of that, because if you ever look to rent a trailer or rent a digger or rent any number of power tools, there are many firms available, but they're not all successful. And Easy Hire, for example, based under the Easy chain name group of names, didn't succeed. It went using crowdfunding, and it didn't generate enough of a momentum as a franchise offering to cut through. So it's just like everything, even in this circular space, there is the ebb and flow of the commercial reality. And as you said, much of this stuff is happening not necessarily at big scale, but it's happening kind of incrementally. I'll come back to whether that is actually satisfactory or whether we need to have more of a breakthrough. But I'll give Maya a chance to reflect on what's happening in the global south.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Tim. If you're in a country like India and a lot of the global south, you see the sort of problems, in fact, of consumption, of huge amounts of growing consumption, are very visible, and you see a lot of waste being thrown everywhere and anywhere. Perhaps there's an upside to that, because you know it's happening. It's not like in Europe, where you perhaps don't notice how much has been consumed, because it's all very nicely managed and taken away from your sight. So there is quite a lot of discussion about the problem. It tends to be seen still as a waste problem. What I would say, and I just want to mention sort of three things. One is, how do we communicate this problem in terms of material usage and sustainable consumption? Who needs to communicate it? And also, what is it? What policies, etc., do we need to have to back it up? So my thinking is that we really do need to communicate circularity in terms of sustainable consumption, in terms of the potential new businesses, the social value. So, as Beth was saying, there are a lot of business opportunities in things like repair. I mentioned upcycling, recycling in a lot of the global south, because labour is cheaper. It is possible to do this. It is viable to have repair businesses. I mean, I think last year I was just with a friend. We were just going into town, and she was like, "Oh, I'm going to bring all my old umbrellas with me, and I'll just get them repaired whilst we're there." Like, no one would ever think of doing that in the UK, but in India, that's still sort of standard, that you can get a lot of things repaired. So part of it, I'd say, is around communicating the benefit. This is jobs for all sorts of people. You can I think communicating in terms of artisan craft type work as well, sort of pride in those skills. But in terms of who communicates in circular economy, I am interested in the power of social media, of influencers, of celebrities. So Instagram and TikTok and those sort of things are actually quite significant in India. And I wouldn't say that they've sort of done it and got there, but there is potential to use influencers to try and shift people's thinking away from, oh, I need a bottle of water, I'll just go and get another plastic bottle and I'll throw it anywhere. Um, Perhaps even with big cars, I'm always a bit concerned about. Um, but it is difficult. People are quite bought into these sort of things of getting richer and buying more stuff. But I'd say looking at who's communicating is also important. But we do have to have the right policy framework and have things like, taxes and charges that are beginning to discourage, single-use materials, single-use products. EPR is beginning to be introduced in India and other global south countries as well. So those sorts of policy solutions very much on the agenda. But things like more charges, more sort of eco-design requirements, those aren't very common. So looking at what the EU has done in terms of eco-design, etc., I would say is also an important element of that policy framework that we need. So I'd like to sort of stress the potential from that eco-design, circular design, and very recently I was at an event with a lot of designers, and they do get excited about the potential from designing in a different way. So that brings us back again to who communicates. So if you get people who are cool and artistic to start talking up the potential of products that are designed to be reused, repaired, recycled, I think that is an area that we should be really looking at. So we don't need to be sort of telling people that they're doing the wrong thing or that they're consuming too much. We talk about it in a different way. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Maya, you feel in some ways like you've kind of lined me up to speak about my presidential report, which is all about the importance of design and how could we in the waste sector link in better with designers to use our experiential learning rather than book learning about the actual stuff that comes down the waste pipeline, and how could we engage better with designers so they could see the consequence of their actions. And I'm delighted that CIWM saw fit to actually develop a bursary program to work with the sort of early careers designers on that concept of circularity or design for circularity, to see how it could better be fostered and developed. And hopefully it ends up as being a proof of concept that can be replicated elsewhere across different material types and across different design philosophies, from graphic designers to industrial designers to product designers, etc., beyond the UK into other jurisdictions as well. But it's a big ask, and it kind of goes back to what Beth was saying a few minutes ago about that momentum of change, that weight of change, and that while we're taking these steps, they do in many regards seem to be or feel to be somewhat incremental. And I know that you, Maya, were mentioning all this stuff around how it's sort of seen as a trigger or a badge of having arrived to have stuff. Now, in Ulster Scots, that's proc, and lots of people here have lots of proc. And the issue we have is, do we need to have so much proc, or could we have less stuff? But it kind of taps into something you were saying about narratives and that idea of what is the storytelling. Now, I was very struck several years ago, actually, several decades ago now, by Anthony Clare, who was a psychiatrist, and he wrote a book and he codified what he saw in many of his patients as affluenza. And he basically said people's desires to own stuff is a pathological response to the environment they find themselves in now. And it has all these symptoms of being a mental disease, which is affluenza. It was also written up more recently by Alain de Botton about 20 years ago as status anxiety, that desire to keep up with the Joneses. And it was this constant, focus on who's got the latest trends, who's got the latest car, who's got the latest fashion, the latest colorings, which we see amplified and broadcast through multiple media platforms and media programs. And I suppose the issue is, going back to Maya, what you said, how do we make some of this stuff we're talking about around designer influencing, how do we make it more trendy? And how do we make it more on point that actually people want to own less or own secondhand, pre-loved, vintage, vintage, whatever we want to call it? How do we make that more desirable than the desire to have some of the latest things? Again, another thing I was very struck by, again going back some time, was the film Gattaca. And if you look at the cars that zoom around in Gattaca, the film starring Jude Law and others, they were really old, stylish 1950s, Citroen DS's and stuff, which had been electrified. So rather than destroy the entire utility of the car, they had taken pre-existing cars. This is, as I said, going back several decades, and they had retrofitted them to become electric for some vision in the near future, 50 years hence. Where is this transition coming? I mentioned a minute ago about this scale, this issue of this moment of movement. So is it that the incremental steps we're taking now are really just the starting stages of the turning of the tide? Or is it, to use a great expression, lipstick on a gorilla?
Mm. Well,
who would like to pick that one up to start with? Well, you started speaking, so I'll give it to you.
I was just going to. I'll just pick up on that. Hand over to Beth. But I do feel that you have put your finger on something that's really important, which is the whole thing of sort of affluenza, keeping up with your neighbours, even being generous. So, for example, in terms of things like food waste, I know we're not talking that much about food waste, but it is something where you feel you're being hospitable and generous. So changing this is really difficult. However, you just mentioned things like movies. I'd like to see a bit more thinking about how we use these different. We're portraying these futures in movies, in other ways, and Materia Verde, the organisation that I'm working with, and Biomaterials, is in fact at the moment part of a company called Quicksand, which is a design studio, and they had organised an event which was around what they call world building. So all of us different groups with sort of environmental mission put something on the table. They had about 6 different groups with all these people who worked on augmented reality and virtual reality and solar punk work, making reels and things like that. And I'd say it was a really interesting way of thinking through how to create change, because I come from a policy background, so I'm normally thinking what sort of taxes or charges would you need, or what sort of infrastructure do you need to develop, who's going to pay for it, and things like that. But there's a very different way of approaching it, of thinking, to get beyond the incremental, we do need to change hearts and minds. And if you see something like minimal housing, minimalism in your housing decor, these sort of things you can change. You can change what sort of building materials you may want to use. You could be using, I was talking about things made from agro wastes. You can get people interested in this. We came up with an idea of when people went to buy something in this shop front, a virtual shop front, they'd be able to see the story behind the product, so they'd know where it came from. They'd been taken into this world, which then connected them to this sort of maybe rural world where these materials derived from. So there's quite a lot of potential, real power in using these different sort of visual mechanisms that us policy people often don't really think about. So that's my thinking in terms of how do we really bolster that shift, that incremental shift, to create a much bigger transformational change.
Okay, that's really interesting because I mean, everybody sort of has pride in their genes. Not everybody, but most people have pride in their genes, and their genes sort of grow as to be part of them. And you're sort of suggesting that there could be this history, this sense of engagement with the products that you own. I'm reaching around the corner here for my little friend. My little friend has been with me ever since I picked him up on the street in the middle of COVID. My little mascot to help me through the dark nights when I'm working away. Um, an unloved, I don't know what it's called nowadays. I'm sure it was a very big thing in the day, but a one-eyed, multicolored unicorn. Um, and it just, to me, symbolizes this kind of throwaway society and these bizarre products that are created that are designed to connect with us.
Mhm.
And I keep it here just beside me as a little reminder that everything has a story. And if we
Mhm.
are looking to create stories that mean that people get invested in what they own, so they feel there's more ownership around this. And I guess, Maya, what you're saying is to create a story around that bigger scale, that industrialization, and that sense of pride that can come from the creation of new products through to an area, through to a sector, through to a supply chain by developing new ways of thinking, new ways of working, and valorizing stuff that was previously just burnt on the field, for example, when you were talking about the rice stubble, instead of being a building product, using various different composite materials or natural materials to give it greater integral strength as a building item. Beth, you want to come in on this at all?
Yeah, lots of things were sparking from what you were saying. One thing I was thinking about, and it's fairly anecdotal, but something that I've noticed a bit recently is that um, you know because our lives are so digital, so online. I'm seeing an increasing number of kind of people I know wanting to engage more kind of physically in the world, whether that be socially, but also through making things. So there's a community workshop near where I live in London called Makerspace, and it's always absolutely full of people, learning how to do woodwork or metalwork, all these things. And that is a really important way of getting people to connect with objects and the time and effort it goes into making them, which I was thinking is actually quite a powerful way of us understanding the products that we live with. But I was also thinking about what you were saying about how do we change how people want to consume, the relationship they have to objects. But another aspect to this is around what other things people care about, because yes, they care about status and consuming things, but also really care about nature. For example, there's an organization called Climate Outreach, and they do a huge amount of work looking at how to communicate about climate change and the action that's being taken and where else is needed in different groups. But they've done a big study recently called Britain Talks Climate and Nature. And what they found is that, and I don't think it's a big surprise, but Britain is a huge lover of nature and really, really cares about the environment, really cares about what environment is there for the future generations. And so I think when we're thinking about circular economy and different ways of producing products and consuming products, and potentially we're going to come on to talk about government policy, but when we're thinking about this, I think thinking about what people really care about as well as consumption is another way to look at this problem. And the UK government is, I think, going to be coming out, particularly the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, with a public participation plan, which I think it's going to come around COP, and that will be really interesting to see what they're thinking there about the role of the public as we look to build a more sustainable economy. And because I think we have had previous governments where they've perhaps minimised that role that we as the public, as consumers, as citizens have to take. And I think that really minimises wrongly the role that we all have to play in this system.
It's a really good point. Although I feel we're kind of straying into the SDGs 13, 14, and 15 all around sort of aquatic and biodiversity and stuff, as opposed to just focusing on SDG 12. But I suppose that's really important because these things are all interconnected. And I think it was John Muir who was the instigator of the American national parks, who said you cannot pick up one thing without picking up everything. And I have to say that, given that the parks were set up well over 150 years ago or so, that idea of early systems thinking, I think, is really, really important. And we're kind of coming back to that. And the likes of RSPB and many of the other organizations working in the environment will know the interconnectedness of everything. I was watching BBC Two last night, Sunday night, and Hamza Yusuf was talking all about his joy of finding the first time he'd seen a sort of a tawny owl and a woodcock working at nighttime. And it's that simple connection that we have with nature that we kind of downplay in our sense of having arrived. That dislocation from our natural world is becoming even more pronounced. The UK has got one of the most depleted biodiversity indexes across Europe and even wider, because we've been very much more exploitative in developing the industrial powerhouse that is and was the UK. So it is interesting that this kind of push back on that, and that people are beginning to connect more with this again. It's almost that sense of loss, and I think that what I call synesthesia, that sense of the passing of time, and that you're aware that things are not as good as they used to be in the natural world because there's not as many butterflies or birds or bees or whatever. And I guess, Maya, are you seeing any of that kind of connection, that kind of integration with with that kind of industrial process that you're seeing in India or that you're hearing about in the global south? Are people aware of the kind of consequences that if they don't make space for nature, there will be no nature?
Difficult one. Yeah, I'd say, of course, there's always going to be a certain number of people that are concerned about this. And, where I live in Goa, there's a very strong environmental movement protecting forests, wetlands, even paddy fields and agricultural lands. There is quite a strong feeling that this must be done. But whether the number that care are enough or powerful enough is another question, because there's such a strong sort of force for making, I suppose, in effect, a business world that wants to make profits out of so-called development. So I would say it's a bit of a clash. And at the moment, probably the environmentalists aren't really, the people who really care probably aren't winning. And a lot of the urban residents are quite divorced, quite separated from the natural world now. They don't really go back to rural areas as much as they used to. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about looking at, say, materials. And in fact, it could be like a QR code. And when you go into it, it will take you back to a village, and you'll see the village and you'll see the people who made it. So we'd like to get people to re-establish those connections. So I think it's certainly possible. But what we've seen in the last few decades, maybe 3 decades or so, is people really almost breaking those links with nature in the countryside. But we did do a little study. Sorry, this seems to be shifting away from, well, I think it's definitely relevant to sustainable consumption, but a little survey on tourism and whether people were interested in ecotourism and things like that. And they definitely put a premium. They like a hotel to be called an eco hotel and talk about ecotourism. So there is still a value that's placed on things like that. Yeah. We just have to keep on working.
We do bring up our kids.
Pardon?
Yeah, we do bring up our kids sort of playing with elephants and giraffes and rhinos and all these, alligators and stuff, and all this stuff that really in the global north, it was not really relevant for a long time, measurable in millennia. And yet there's this kind of connection that we make with children at a very, very basic age, where there's all these stories about Babar, the elephant, and how his family, in anthropocentric manner, go around the sort of managing their village and going on trips and stuff. This concept, though, of being part of something else that's bigger than you is instilled at a very early age. But somewhere along the way, it gets overlaid by the idea. I guess it's going to be as we pass through our teens and begin to become conscious of, the idea of setting out and striding out on our own, that we have to have our own badges of individuality, and we look to take points of reference from the wider society we see around us, and what does successful look like, and we immediately tilt towards those who have conspicuous consumption tendencies, to have the bigger watch, the bigger car, 3 houses, 1,000 pairs of shoes. And because we have created an economic paradigm that we can never sort that out. We can never purchase everything there is to purchase. Wasn't it John Paul Getty who said, well, how much is enough? And he just said, there isn't enough. We just need more. There is no end game. It's just more. So in that context, where you have that sense of affluenza, where you are terminally just almost rapacious in your appetite to just have more of everything, anything, all the time, it's very difficult to say, well, hang on, you only have so many days in the week. You've only got so many hours in the day. You've only got so many wrists you can put a watch on. Why do you need all this stuff? And they're actually like barnacles. They come like encrustations that slow you down mentally, physically, spiritually, and every which other way, because you end up being enthralled to all this stuff. And you're concerned when you're not there, when you go on holiday, is somebody else breaking in? Oh, my car, is it scratched? Can I park in this car park? We have this perversity where we want one thing, but we actually want to do something else. And so we're into this issue, which is on our little list of consumption issues that we're supposed to be discussing. How do we get people to connect more realistically with what they have, what they own, why they would want it? And also, I suppose, something we don't really talk about, when do we think it's time to give up stuff? When do we think it's time to let it free into a charity shop, into a bin, into a recycling box, gift it away to somebody else? When do we actually have that discussion internally as part of our internal dialogue to go, I don't need that 1,000 pairs of shoes. I only need 200. No, sorry. I only need 20, 220, whatever the figure is. But we don't seem to be creating that narrative that it's okay to want lots of stuff, but at some stage you kind of need to grow out of that. It's almost like a phase of growth. And you go like, does that become in your 30s, in your 40s, in your 20s? And you were talking about storytelling earlier on. For me, there's a big thing about storytelling. The stories we have are no longer really fit for purpose. If you look at the stories of the Grimm brothers, if you look at the stories of Aesop's fables, they all served a purpose back in their day to engage with the wider societal issues. And yet we haven't really updated the stories to give the natural storytellers something to say. And one of the problems as environmentalists we have is that the only story we can tell is you have to do with less. It's going to be more problematic. It's going to cost you more. It's not an appealing narrative. And so we have to come up with a better narrative about, Beth, you were talking about that community engagement. What do you really value? You're not going to, lie on your sick bed and go, oh, I wish I had bought those Manolo Blahniks or that, Philippe Patek or Rolex or whatever. And there are lots of other brands available. But you'll say, God, I wish I'd gone and I'd visit my parents. I wish I'd taken that holiday with my friends. I wished I'd focused more when I was in school doing stuff. It's generally the experiences we regret. rather than the possessions we don't have that we regret. How do we get that across? I'm not sure who would like to jump in there.
Is it your turn, Beth? Was it mine?
I'm happy
Is
to
that a
jump
hospital
in.
bath?
But I was going to take it in a different direction. So, Maya, if you wanted to
Well, I
come in
may
first,
just
that's
jump
totally
in.
fine.
Well, I'd say, say for example, in India, we'd say things like furniture. It's still these sort of things are still relatively expensive in comparison with, say, furniture in the West. So people are keeping it for longer, and then. When I moved into the development I thought maybe somebody would just give me their old furniture for free. I thought there must be somebody moving out. Surely they could just. But in fact, there was a value that was placed on things like furniture, and people do buy quite good qualities. The richer people buy quite good quality stuff. But then when you go a little bit further down market, it's not very good quality stuff. But even when I was in DEFRA talking to IKEA were even thinking about how they could make their furniture personalised, almost like heirloom furniture. So you would be able to personalise it. Maybe you'd be putting some designs onto your pine cabinet or something like that. So I think there are ways of making things more personal and then maybe wanting to hold on to them. My feeling is that there's some things where we can try and discourage people from buying them, especially things like disposable stuff, disposable cups and cutlery and all sorts of things that are disposable. But some things like clothing, etc., it's going to be quite hard. People have got into this sort of way of thinking that you don't wear things many times, etc. And that is where this idea of just reselling things, using whether it's Vinted or Depop or whatever, really just allowing that to continue to happen, where you just keep selling stuff. You don't want it, but somebody else will want it. We do need to ensure that they're designed so that they can be, that they're not just going to, unravel in a few, whatever, after 6 months. I want to make one other little point about the narrative. I really do think there is something in things like cinema documentaries, because being where I'm in India, I'm not sure I ever saw so many documentaries being made by people, little short movies, little all sorts of things. And some of them will take you back. They'll take you to a pre-earlier world, and show you what the villages were like and how people lived. And I think all of those have a lot of power as well. Some of them are about nature. So I'm really putting that sort of value of cinema, movies, shorts, reels, etc., quite high up there. I'll hand over to Beth now. I think
I'm looking at
Beth,
Beth. I'm looking at
Yeah.
Beth in case she wants to say anything back.
No,
If she doesn't,
No, I do. No, I think you're absolutely right about the power of TV and visuals, and it's something that we talk about with our businesses quite a lot. But I think one of the big opportunities to change this is around pulling some of those big levers that we have available, and also showing the opportunity. And there's some really fantastic things that some of the examples that I mentioned earlier, but there is jobs and economic value being created in the circular economy, and that really being able to showcase that, I think, starts to change how we think about this linear consumption into something that's more circular. And, one of our members, Suez, they have got a network of repair shops that they've been developing, where they pick up items and refurbish and repair them, and that's providing employment locally and skills development. Some really fantastic stuff that is happening at scale. And I think the thing that you mentioned it earlier, but the thing that we haven't really talked about is what is some of those big levers, and that's where we sort of come to my favorite subject, policy, which is, I really do think that government policy has a huge role to play in shifting this and upscaling up, because for businesses that are implementing more circular practices in their supply chain and with their customers, one of the big challenges they find is that doing it on their own is really challenging, because they come up against costs and regulatory barriers that just make it harder. And so there is a huge role for governments across the world to do something about this, and also to fundamentally change the way we think about materials. So Maya mentioned it earlier, but something like extended producer responsibility, that means that if you're putting something as a business out into the world, you have responsibility for it, particularly as it gets collected in its end of life. So in the UK, for example, we've just introduced extended producer responsibility for packaging. And this is meaning that, all the packaging that goods are, wrapped in, all the cardboard, glass, plastic, that is now going to have a fee attached to it. And that fee is going to go to local authorities, and perhaps, Tim, something that you will know a huge amount about, but to help with collection and the infrastructure that's needed to process and sort this. And I think not only does that have the potential to really change practices, but it's a really big deal that everyone's going to interact with and shift where costs are felt. And I think that has the opportunity to influence how we all think about our consumption and production. In a similar way, eco-design, how do we use policy to change the way we design products so that they last longer, they have more sustainable materials in them, and then at the end of life they can be taken apart and perhaps their constituent materials reused. Things like deposit return schemes, these already operate very well across the world, including in some European countries, and something that they're looking to introduce in the UK. But this is, something where you as a consumer will take your plastic drink bottle back to the supermarket and get a charge back. And so that's a really good way of us engaging in this process and bringing it to the fore. So I think things like this, these big levers that can be pulled to change the way we fundamentally interact as consumers, producers, and government, can start shifting things and change the way we think about it, as well as, of course, all the narrative stuff that we just.
That's really powerful stuff, and it kind of is almost a good note to start wrapping up on. Certainly, one of my last calls when I was wearing the chains was that I felt that every item placed on the market should have full producer responsibility embedded in it as a policy imperative from the get-go, with the only exception being if the producer could make a justifiable case for why the costs should be borne by the taxpayer as opposed to by the original producer. And I felt that would have a transformative effect on the entire value of materials placed on the marketplace, but also would tighten up the leakage of materials out of the value chain. Because if materials had a value and were not seen as having a null value or a zero value, it meant that even if they were discarded to another person, they would have a value which could be reclaimed. That begins to bring in the DRS and other things as well, but I'm not going to go there today. But yeah, I think that those are very powerful comments, Beth, you made. And Maya, as you've got a policy background, I'm going to give you the last word on this matter.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. Well, I agree that sort of handful of policies that we're talking about are really important. So extended producer responsibility, let's throw in things like the taxes and charges, like plastics taxes, plastic bag charges. These sort of things, we do need to try to embed them and make them sort of mainstreamed. Eco-design also, we need to have this clarity of what we mean by circular design and eco-design. And it is very complicated, because I used to work on this, and like every different product, it takes absolutely ages to agree everything on each product. So we have to try and simplify and get these principles embedded into design of products. I also think the information, giving into consumers information through things like product passports, some of what I was talking about, giving a sort of window into the product. There's a lot of opportunity there from the policies on, product passports. I'd like to mention, and I didn't really talk about things like taxes and charges like ETS type systems on incineration, but that's also an area where, the tax system needs to be rationalised. So we have got the drivers in the right direction. I'm going to mention something slightly different, which is what I'm working on in India, which is having an innovation ecosystem, which I feel that governments can help develop. So in India, there are quite a lot of different clusters. Businesses often operate in clusters. There's like a textile cluster in this place and another one here and whatever else. So I'd say bringing businesses together in a sort of place, making sure you then get sort of R&D institutes that can help with materials and design, and also ancillary businesses like LCA, all sorts of different things. We know how important LCA is to communicate the benefits of these products. Getting that innovation ecosystem really also needs to support the set of startups you need. You may need startups that are going to be ensuring products are reused and resold, others that can recycle all sorts of different things. So bringing, how does finance connect to this? So we talk about green finance, but a lot of green finance will go to very big established companies that could probably already have got finance. But how do you bring investors and others in to support these new businesses? So we need to make sure a whole value chain works, every link of it. And that's slightly different way of thinking from thinking of EPR and eco design and product passports and charges. So I'd like to bring that thinking into what we're all working on. So businesses can take the lead, local authorities can take lead. I'd say there's a lot of potential for that. And there may be even potential to link up between the UK and a cluster in India and think, okay, we'll be working with that cluster on textile recycling. We can share knowledge and information. So working across boundaries, I think there's a lot of potential, could be really exciting. So I'll leave it at that, Tim. Thank you.
There's a rake load of stuff there, and I'm just delighted that we've had a really very far-ranging discussion this evening. We did go off down quite a big rabbit hole in the middle, but I think it's good because it's something we don't really consider. We get very lost in the technical stuff, and we don't consider the social engagement aspects or how we can kind of contribute or develop that, I think, in a more fulsome manner, because it's easy for many of us as varied forms of technocrats to get lost into the detail of the machinations of stuff, which kind of edit out how people actually work with things. Anyway, I'm not going to go on about that, but what I would say to anybody who's listening, if anybody would like to pick up on any of these aspects, I am sure if they were to get in touch with CIWM, they may form the basis of a future podcast. So what I'll do is I'll say thank you on behalf of myself, Tim Walker, Maya de Souza, and Beth Barker. And are there any final words either of you would like to give? On the basis that I'm not hearing anything, I'm just going to say, oh, sorry, Beth, you're going to say?
Going to say one thing we didn't talk about, and obviously I feel like I have to mention, is the exciting role that data can play in all of this, and that very much plays into what Maya was talking about around digital product passports and the opportunity to share data and connect up one business's waste with another one's product. And there's so much potential here if we can track where materials are using data and digital infrastructure. And so that is a huge opportunity, and I'm really excited to see where it goes in the next few years. So I think, got a shout out for a bit of data and AI.
And actually, Tim, maybe I'll finish on a sort of interconnected point. Well, I'd say working across boundaries across from Europe or UK to countries like India, Indonesia, African countries. I think there's a lot of potential there. And I'd love to sort of continue that discussion and see that discussion continued so that we have a sort of global circular economy. That would be great in so many different ways. We started on geopolitical tensions, but I think there's a lot of opportunity as well.
You've nicely primed me up. I wasn't going to mention this because I'd forgotten about it, but the CRWM bursary recently supported the waste aid program in the Gambia. It will be the topic of a future podcast, which is coming shortly. So if anyone is interested in that issue of how we in the UK and beyond can contribute and can learn from the Global South, that podcast will be well worth listening into. And thank you for that offer, that challenge, and that invitation. So, Maya, I'm going to sign off now. Beth, thank you for your input. And it's been a pleasure speaking to you both. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you.